Look at what they've done.
Look at the lead boat.
Most people think of Vikings as savage raiders who grabbed whatever sharp object was lying around. But here's what no one tells you. Viking weapons were precision-engineered instruments of psychological warfare, designed not just to kill, but to absolutely terrorize anyone who saw them in action. The Dane axe measured between 0.9 to 1.2 meters, or 3 to 4 feet in length, with a crescent-shaped blade that could span 22 centimeters, or 8.7 inches across. To put that in perspective, imagine a modern fire axe, then double the blade size, and add a handle long enough to give you serious leverage. Now imagine that thing being swung by a 6-foot Viking who's been training with it since childhood. The blade was thin enough to slice through mail armor like it was made of paper, yet weighted perfectly to deliver bone-crushing impact. One swing could penetrate a wooden shield, the armor beneath it, and still have enough force left over to split ribs. While other cultures treated axes as crude tools, Vikings elevated axe fighting to an art form. They developed techniques that could hook enemy weapons, tear shields apart, and create openings that no sword could match. Imagine facing a Viking shield wall, knowing that behind each shield lurked a warrior capable of reaching over your defense with a weapon that could split you from shoulder to hip. It wasn't just the physical damage. It was the knowledge that your traditional armor and tactics were suddenly obsolete. Now, you might be wondering how a primitive medieval society managed to create weapons that were both terrifyingly effective and surprisingly sophisticated. The answer lies in a metallurgical revolution that most people never hear about. Vikings weren't just skilled warriors. They were master metallurgists who developed techniques that wouldn't be fully understood by modern science until the 20th century. The secret was in their steel. While most of Europe was still struggling with inconsistent iron, Viking smiths had perfected a process called pattern welding that created blades of incredible strength and flexibility. They would take strips of iron with different carbon contents, twist them together, then forge them into a single piece. The result was a blade with a distinctive wavy pattern that looked almost supernatural, and performed like it too. But here's where it gets really interesting. These weren't mass-produced weapons. Each blade was a custom creation that could take months to complete. The process was so complex that smiths were considered almost magical figures in Viking society. They had to understand not just metalworking, but chemistry, physics, and even psychology. The smith would start with bog iron ore that had been naturally processed in marshes over centuries. This wasn't random. Bog iron had specific properties that made it perfect for weapons. It was low in sulfur and phosphorus, impurities that would make the metal brittle. The Vikings had somehow figured out what modern metallurgists needed electron microscopes to understand. Then came the real artistry. The smith would forge the iron into thin rods, some with high carbon content for hardness, others with low carbon for flexibility. These rods were then twisted together in patterns that weren't just decorative, they were functional. The twisting created a composite structure that could absorb impact without breaking, while maintaining a sharp edge that could cut through virtually anything. The final step was the most dangerous: differential tempering. The smith would heat the blade to precise temperatures, around 750 to 800 degrees Celsius, or 1,382 to 1,472 degrees Fahrenheit, and then cool different parts at different rates. The edge would be quenched rapidly to make it diamond hard, while the spine was cooled slowly to keep it flexible. Get this wrong, and months of work would shatter with the first blow. And even if you think that sounds impressive, there's something else that'll blow your mind. Vikings were doing this in crude forges with nothing but charcoal, bellows, and hammer. No thermometers, no precise measurements, no modern tools, Just centuries of accumulated knowledge passed down through generations of smiths who treated their craft like sacred art. The finished weapons weren't just tools. They were heirlooms worth more than most people's entire possessions. A single pattern-welded sword could cost as much as a small farm, which explains why Vikings were so protective of their weapons, and why losing one in battle was considered a fate worse than death. These weapons weren't just beautiful and effective, they were built to last. Archaeologists have found Viking weapons that are over 1,000 years old and still sharp enough to shave with. Try that with a modern kitchen knife. You've probably seen movie Vikings swinging around massive two-handed axes, roaring as they charge into battle. Here's the thing, Hollywood actually got this one mostly right. The Viking battle axe was absolutely devastating, but not for the reasons you might think. While knights were obsessing over expensive swords that took years to master, Vikings had figured out something brilliant. An axe was not only cheaper to make, but in the right hands, it was actually superior to a sword in most combat situations. And before you scoff at that statement, let's walk you through exactly why medieval Europe learned to fear the sound of an axe cutting through air. First, let's talk physics. A sword distributes its force along a relatively long edge, but an axe concentrates all that kinetic energy into a much smaller contact point. When a 2 kilogram or 4.4 pound axe head traveling at 67 miles per hour hits a shield, it's delivering roughly 900 joules of energy to a space the size of a quarter. That's enough force to punch through a wooden shield, chainmail, and still have momentum left over to shatter bone. But raw power was just the beginning. Viking axes were designed with a specific curvature that created what modern physicists call mechanical advantage. The curved blade didn't just cut, it hooked. A skilled Viking could catch an enemy's weapon, wrench it aside, and deliver a fatal blow before his opponent could recover. Try doing that with a straight sword. The tactical advantages were even more impressive. In the tight confines of a shield wall, where swords became awkward and ineffective, axes could still deliver devastating overhead strikes. Vikings developed techniques for fighting in formation, where the front rank would use shields, while the second rank wielded long axes, creating a mobile meat grinder that could chew through enemy lines. Vikings understood specialized weapons. They didn't just have one type of axe, they had different designs for different situations. The broad axe for breaking shields, the bearded axe for hooking weapons, and the massive Dane axe for pure psychological warfare. The bearded axe deserves special mention because it was perhaps the most ingenious weapon design of the medieval period. The beard was an extended lower portion of the blade that allowed Vikings to hook shields and weapons while protecting their own hands. It was like having a multi-purpose tool that could cut, hook, and trap, all while being light enough to use with one hand. Let me tell you about Gram, Tyrfing, and Skofno, names that once made hardened warriors cross themselves and pray they'd never meet these weapons in battle. Because in Viking society, the most legendary swords weren't just tools of war. They were characters in their own right, with genealogies, personalities, and reputations that often outlived their wielders. This wasn't just medieval superstition. It was a reflection of something far more practical and terrifying. These named swords represented the absolute pinnacle of Viking weapon making. Blades so superior to ordinary weapons that they seemed almost otherworldly in their craftsmanship and power. Take the process of creating a pattern-welded sword, which was like performing metallurgical surgery with Stone Age tools. The mastersmith would start with up to 7 different iron rods, each with carefully controlled carbon content. These weren't random pieces of metal. Each rod was forged to have specific properties that would contribute to the finished blade's performance. The smith would then forge these rods into thin strips, some containing up to 0.8% carbon for hardness, others with as little as 0.2% for flexibility. Then came the twisting process that created the distinctive serpentine patterns. But here's what most people don't realize. Those patterns weren't just decorative. They were functional indicators of the blade's internal structure, like a roadmap showing where the hard and soft steel met. The resulting blade had a composite structure that modern engineers would recognize as a primitive form of laminated steel. The core was flexible enough to absorb impact without breaking, while the edges were hard enough to maintain razor sharpness through countless battles. It was essentially a medieval carbon fiber sword, created through pure craftsmanship and generations of accumulated knowledge. But the real magic happened in the final steps. The blade would be heated to precise temperatures. Too hot, and the steel would become brittle. Too cool, and it wouldn't harden properly. The smith had to judge this by the color of the metal in flickering firelight, relying on experience that had been passed down through generations. Then came the quenching, where the blade was rapidly cooled in water, oil, or even urine. Yes, really. The ammonia had specific chemical properties that affected the steel. The finished product was nothing short of miraculous by medieval standards. A pattern-welded sword could cut through ordinary iron weapons like they were made of tin. The blade would flex without breaking, spring back to perfect straightness, and hold an edge that could slice through mail armor. This is why Vikings named their best swords and passed them down through generations like family heirlooms. A weapon of this quality wasn't just expensive, it was irreplaceable. The knowledge to create them was held by a handful of master smiths, and the process was so complex that even experienced craftsmen failed more often than they succeeded. The social implications were staggering. In a society where your survival depended on your ability to fight, owning a superior weapon meant the difference between life and death. A warrior with a pattern-welded sword didn't just have a better tool, he had a decisive advantage that could turn the tide of any personal combat. And if you think the Vikings were being dramatic about their weapon obsession, consider this. Modern metallurgists studying these ancient blades have found that some Viking swords contained steel that was actually superior to what was being produced in Europe as late as the 18th century. These weren't primitive tools, they were technological marvels that represented the absolute peak of pre-industrial metallurgy. While everyone obsesses over Viking swords and axes, there's one weapon that actually dominated Norse warfare, and it's the one that gets the least attention. The spear, ubiquitous, practical, and devastatingly effective in ways that weren't immediately obvious. Here's what most people miss about Viking spears. They weren't just sharpened sticks. These were precision-engineered killing machines designed specifically for the unique challenges of naval combat, where one wrong move could send you plunging into icy water while wearing 30 pounds of gear. Picture the cramped deck of a Viking longship, maybe 2 meters or 6.5 feet wide at most, packed with 30 warriors and their equipment. Now imagine trying to swing a sword or axe without hitting your own crew. Suddenly, a 2-meter spear with a 30-centimeter or 12-inch leaf-shaped blade starts looking like the smartest weapon choice possible. But the real genius was in the versatility. Viking spears weren't just thrusting weapons, they were designed for slashing, hooking, and even throwing. The broad, leaf-shaped blade could deliver cuts that were nearly as effective as a sword, while the pointed tip could punch through mail armor with surgical precision. It was like having a sword, axe, and javelin all rolled into one. The tactical advantages at sea were overwhelming. When Viking ships closed for boarding action, the crew would form up with spears, creating a bristling wall of steel points. Enemy sailors trying to leap from ship to ship would find themselves facing a forest of spear tips, each one capable of skewering them mid-jump. It was medieval area denial at its finest. And here's the part that really showcases Viking tactical thinking. They developed specialized naval spear techniques that had no equivalent in land warfare. The ship killer thrust was designed to punch through the wooden planks of enemy vessels below the waterline. A coordinated spear attack could literally sink a ship by turning it into a colander. Even more impressive was how Vikings adapted spear tactics for different situations. In river raids, they could use spears to push off from banks and obstacles while maintaining combat readiness. During beach landings, spears became walking sticks that could support warriors in full armor crossing treacherous terrain. On land, they could be planted in the ground to create instant fortifications. The construction itself was a marvel of medieval engineering. The spearhead was socketed, meaning it fitted over the shaft rather than being attached with a tang, which created a stronger, more durable connection. The socket was often reinforced with iron straps that extended down the shaft, preventing the head from being chopped off in combat. But perhaps the most telling detail about Viking spears is this. When archaeologists excavate Viking graves, they find spears in 85% of warrior graves burials, compared to only 15% containing swords. The spear wasn't just a weapon, it was the weapon that built the Viking Age. After everything we've covered, the engineering marvels, the tactical innovations, the brutal effectiveness, there's one Viking weapon that was more powerful than all the rest combined. It couldn't be forged, couldn't be wielded, and couldn't be stolen. It was their reputation, and it was absolutely devastating. By the 9th century, the mere rumor of Viking ships on the horizon was enough to make entire coastal populations flee inland. This wasn't just fear of physical violence, it was systematic psychological warfare that Vikings had perfected over generations. They understood something that modern military strategists are still studying. The most effective weapon is often the one that makes fighting unnecessary. Consider the impact of the berserker phenomenon. Whether you believed they were consuming psychoactive substances, entering religious trances, or simply using psychological intimidation tactics, the effect was the same. Enemy forces would break and run at the sight of warriors who seemed to feel no pain and fear no death. It was psychological terrorism, refined to an art form. But the genius went deeper than just scary warriors. Vikings had weaponized uncertainty itself. Their hit-and-run tactics, unpredictable raid patterns, and ability to appear anywhere there was navigable water created a climate of perpetual anxiety across medieval Europe. Coastal communities couldn't prepare for Viking attacks because they never knew when or where they would come. The longship was as much a psychological weapon as a transportation device. Its shallow draft meant Vikings could sail up rivers that seemed safe, appearing hundreds of miles inland where no one expected seaborne raiders. The sight of a dragon-prowed longship emerging from morning mist was enough to make medieval chroniclers reach for supernatural explanations. Vikings also understood the power of selective brutality. They weren't mindlessly violent, they were strategically violent. Certain targets would be completely destroyed as object lessons, while others would be left deliberately untouched to spread stories of Viking capabilities. It was a calculated campaign of psychological conditioning that made future raids easier and more profitable. The naming of weapons and the cultivation of warrior reputations served the same purpose. When word spread that a particular Viking carried a legendary blade or had survived impossible odds, it created a force multiplier that made individual warriors seem larger than life. Enemy combatants would hesitate, doubt themselves, and make fatal mistakes when facing someone with that kind of reputation. Religious and cultural factors amplified the psychological impact. Vikings fought with a genuine belief that death in battle led to Valhalla, which gave them a fearlessness that seemed supernatural to Christian opponents who feared death and damnation. This wasn't just bravado, it was a fundamental worldview that made Vikings genuinely more dangerous in combat. Even after the Viking Age ended, the psychological impact persisted for centuries. Coastal fortifications built specifically to defend against Viking raids remained active long after the threat had passed. The word Viking itself became synonymous with sudden, unstoppable violence. The Vikings understood something that modern warfare has largely forgotten. The most devastating weapon is often the one that exists in your enemy's mind. And in that arena, They were absolutely unstoppable. In today's video, we'll explore 10 of the most brutal Viking weapons that rarely make it into Hollywood depictions. While swords steal the spotlight in popular culture, they were luxury items for the elite. Most Vikings wielded far more brutal and surprisingly ingenious weapons. These weapons weren't merely designed to kill, they were crafted to maximize damage while serving multiple purposes, reflecting a culture where resourcefulness was as valuable as raw strength. From farming tools repurposed for battle to armor-shattering inventions, these forgotten weapons reveal why Norse raiders struck fear across medieval Europe. Let's begin. While axes are certainly associated with Vikings, the specialized skegox, or bearded axe, remains less familiar to most. What makes this weapon distinctive is its asymmetrical blade with an elongated beard, or lower edge, that extends down and back toward the handle. This wasn't just an aesthetic choice, it was a lethal design innovation. The extended lower edge served multiple deadly purposes. It allowed warriors to hook an opponent's shield or weapon, pulling it down or away to create an opening for a lethal strike. This hooking capability made the bearded axe particularly effective at disarming opponents or dragging a shield aside just long enough to deliver a finishing blow with the upper edge of the blade. Archaeological findings show these axes were usually 15 to 20 inches in length, easily wielded with one hand while holding a shield in the other. The skegox's brutal effectiveness came from its versatility. It could deliver crushing blows through chainmail, hook limbs to topple opponents, and even serve as a utility tool when not in battle. Bearded axes found in grave sites often show signs of both combat damage and wear from everyday use, highlighting the Vikings' practical approach to their weapons. Mentioned prominently in Norse sagas, yet often overlooked in popular culture, the atgeir was a fearsome polearm that combined the reach of a spear with the cutting power of an axe. The weapon features a long wooden shaft, topped with a spear point, and one or more auxiliary blades or hooks extending from the sides. The Icelandic sagas speak of the atgeir with particular reverence. In Njal's saga, the character Gunnar of Hlíðarendi is described wielding his atgeir with such skill that it sang as it cut through the air, before cleaving both armor and flesh. The saga describes how no shield could withstand it when properly wielded. The atgeir proved devastating in formation fighting due to its extended reach, allowing warriors to strike from behind the shield wall. Its secondary blades could effectively hook enemy shields or inflict horrific slashing wounds. With a balanced design enabling quick recovery after thrusts, this versatile weapon excelled in both offensive charges and defensive stands. Unlike many weapons that required years of training, the atgeir's design made it relatively straightforward to use effectively with basic instruction, making it ideal for the Viking societal structure, where all free men were expected to fight when called upon. Perhaps the most ubiquitous yet underappreciated Viking weapon was the seax, a single-edged knife that blurred the line between tool and weapon. Every Viking, regardless of social status, would have carried a seax. These knives range from small utility blades about 5 inches long to formidable langseax versions, reaching up to 20 inches, effectively short swords. The seax's brutal efficiency came from its design. A thick, heavy back edge provided weight for crushing force, while the single sharp edge could be maintained at extreme sharpness. The blade typically featured a distinctive broken back design, with the spine angling down toward the point, creating an ideal stabbing geometry that could puncture even mail armor when driven with sufficient force. What made the seax particularly dangerous was its omnipresence and concealability. While swords would be set aside during peaceful meetings or in certain settings, the seax was considered a tool and thus remained on its owner's person at virtually all times. Norse graves consistently include seaxes alongside everyday items, revealing how integrated these weapons were into daily life. Historical accounts tell of Vikings using seaxes with devastating effect in close-quarter combat situations where larger weapons became unwieldy. The langseax represents the largest variant of the seax family, occupying a middle ground between knife and sword. With blades typically measuring between 12 to 20 inches, these weapons were substantial enough for serious combat, but more accessible than the expensive swords reserved for elites. Archaeological findings from Viking settlements and burial sites across Scandinavia and England show langseaxes were particularly common during the 9th and 10th centuries, coinciding with the height of Viking expansion. Unlike the standard seax, which curved downward at the tip, many langseaxes featured a more sword-like profile with a straighter spine ending in a clipped point. With a thick spine and single-edged blade, the langseax concentrated force precisely where needed, shearing through padded armor with terrifying effectiveness. Despite this power, warriors wielded it with surprising speed in tight quarters. The substantial tang, the portion of the blade extending into the handle, often ran the full length of the wooden or bone grip, ensuring these weapons could withstand the shock of blocking even the heaviest strikes. The langseax served as a status symbol for successful raiders and freemen who couldn't afford swords but had progressed beyond basic weapons. Many examples feature simple but distinctive pattern welding in the blade and decorative elements on the handle, showing they were valued possessions rather than mere tools. The krokspjord represents one of the more specialized weapons in the Viking arsenal. This hooked spear featured a standard spearhead with the addition of one or more backward-facing hooks forged into the blade or socket. While less common than standard spears, sagas and archaeological findings confirm these weapons saw use, particularly among warriors who specialized in anti-cavalry tactics or shield wall combat. The practical brutality of the krokspjord becomes evident when considering its function. Once the weapon penetrated flesh, the hook made extraction exceedingly difficult and traumatic. Pulling away from a standard spear might allow an injured opponent to retreat. The krokspjord ensured that withdrawal would cause catastrophic additional damage, as the hook tore through tissue. Beyond inflicting horrific wounds, the krokspjord excelled at a key Viking combat tactic: shield manipulation. The hook could catch the rim of an enemy's shield, allowing the wielder to pull it down or aside, creating an opening for allies to exploit. In the densely packed shield walls where much of Viking combat occurred, creating even momentary vulnerabilities often proved decisive. The sagas describe the krokspjord as a weapon that caused particular fear among opponents, not just for its physical damage, but for the psychological impact. The prospect of being caught by such a weapon added another dimension of terror to facing Viking raiders. The kestja represents another polearm from the Viking arsenal, similar to, but distinct from the atgeir. Norse sagas describe it as a heavy thrusting and cutting weapon with a substantial blade. Based on literary descriptions and limited archaeological evidence, the kestja appears to have been a versatile polearm with a longer and heavier blade than standard spears. What separated the kestja from other polearms was its substantial heft. Contemporary accounts suggest it required significant strength to wield effectively, but rewarded that strength with devastating impact. The substantial blade could deliver powerful chopping blows capable of shearing through shields, while the point maintained the thrusting capability essential for formation fighting. The sagas frequently mention the kestja in the hands of elite warriors and chieftains. In Egil's saga, the weapon features prominently in several key battles. Particularly brutal was the kestja's effectiveness against cavalry. The substantial blade could injure or kill horses while keeping riders at a distance, making it a specialized weapon for confronting mounted opponents, a tactical consideration that became increasingly important as Vikings expanded into territories where they might face armored horsemen. While the seax has received more historical attention, the humble knifer represented the most ubiquitous cutting implement in Viking society. smaller than the say axe and typically measuring 3 to 5 inches in blade length, the nifa was carried by virtually everyone, men, women, and even children, as an essential everyday tool. What made the nifa relevant as a weapon was its omnipresence and utility. These knives were razor sharp from constant maintenance, as they served for everything from food preparation to wood carving. When violence erupted unexpectedly, the nifa was always at hand, ready to be drawn from a belt sheath or neck lanyard. Archaeological evidence shows these knives were often carried in pairs or even sets of 3, each sized and shaped for different tasks. Many graves of both warriors and civilians contain multiple nifa, suggesting their importance transcended simple utility. The smaller size made them particularly effective for precise strikes to vulnerable areas, exactly the sort of opportunistic attack that might occur in close quarters or when primary weapons were unavailable. The cultural significance of the nifa extended beyond its practical uses. Gift knives often featured decorated handles or sheaths, and the quality of a person's everyday knife reflected their status and wealth. Far from being mere tools, these small blades held significant cultural importance and served as silent reminders that every Viking, warrior or not, had the means for violence close at hand. Viking shields themselves served as weapons, with the metal shield boss, the central metal dome, designed for offensive as well as defensive purposes. While the wooden shield with its iron reinforcement could block incoming strikes, the pronounced metal boss protruding from the center could be used to deliver stunning blows to an opponent's face or body. Archaeological findings show that many Viking shield bosses were not simply hemispherical, but featured a pronounced spike or point at the apex. This design transition wasn't decorative, it created a focused striking surface that could deliver tremendous force to a very small area, potentially puncturing armor or causing significant blunt trauma even through protective gear. The technique of shield striking appears repeatedly in Norse sagas, where warriors are described using their shields as offensive weapons in close combat. The shield boss strike was particularly effective when fighting in tight formations, where drawing back a weapon for a full swing might be impossible. A quick forward thrust with the shield could stun an opponent long enough to follow with a blade strike. This technique gained its brutal edge through the element of surprise. An opponent focused on avoiding a Viking's weapon might not anticipate the shield itself becoming a deadly implement. The Dane axe represents perhaps the most iconic Viking weapon that actually saw widespread historical use. Unlike the one-handed axes used with shields, the Dane axe was a two-handed weapon, featuring a broad, thin blade mounted on a shaft, typically ranging from 3 to 5 feet in length. This weapon gained prominence particularly in the later Viking Age and remained in use by their descendants in the Anglo-Scandinavian military traditions. Despite its impressive size, the Dane axe combined reach, cutting power, and surprising lightness to devastating effect. The thin blade and carefully balanced design made it remarkably maneuverable in skilled hands. With its long handle providing tremendous leverage, warriors could deliver powerful cuts capable of shearing through mail armor or severing limbs with a single stroke. Archaeological evidence shows these axes were often more carefully crafted than their utilitarian appearance might suggest. The blades were typically pattern welded with a harder steel edge, welded to a more flexible iron body, the same technique used in the finest swords. This sophisticated construction allowed the axe to maintain a razor edge while absorbing the shock of heavy strikes without shattering. The simple hand axe represents the most democratic weapon in the Viking arsenal, an everyday tool found in virtually every household that doubled as an effective weapon when needed. Unlike specialized military axes, these were working tools designed primarily for woodcutting, construction, and shipbuilding. What made these ordinary axes effective weapons was their ubiquity and the familiarity their owners had with them. A Viking who spent hours each week using an axe for daily tasks developed the strength, coordination, and intuitive understanding needed to wield it effectively in combat. While lacking the specialized features of dedicated war axes, the typical hand axe still concentrated significant weight behind a relatively narrow cutting edge. Archaeological findings show these everyday axes were typically 12 to 16 inches in total length, with a modestly sized head weighing about 1 to 2 pounds. The blade shape varied based on primary function, with some featuring a broader edge for woodworking, while others had a more pointed profile better suited to splitting logs, and coincidentally, more effective for penetrating armor. The historical impact of these humble weapons shouldn't be underestimated. The first Viking raids on England and Francia were likely carried out by men armed primarily with their everyday tools rather than specialized military equipment. What makes these weapons particularly fascinating is how they blur the line between tool and weapon. In a society where every free person was expected to defend their community when called upon, the distinction between everyday implement and instrument of war was often non-existent. The same axe that built a longship might later be used to raid a coastal monastery. The knife that carved a child's toy might end an enemy's life in a shield wall clash. Yet, weapons are just a part of the Vikings' survival story. We all know the image: ruthless Norse warriors storming the shores with axes raised, striking fear into medieval Europe. But what if Viking supremacy, as we know it, is missing a crucial chapter? What if the reason Vikings eventually turned west to raid Britain and France wasn't just opportunity, but necessity? Because heading south meant entering waters already claimed by an enemy who had turned the Baltic Sea into their personal hunting ground. And among them, one group stood out, a force that made even hardened Norse raiders hesitate before approaching their shores. The Wends, a confederation of Slavic tribes who ruled the southern Baltic coast and held something the Vikings desperately wanted but could rarely seize by force: control over the region's richest trade routes. While history remembers the Vikings as unstoppable sea wolves, the Wends were the ones who taught them that even wolves can drown. The name Wends itself comes from Germanic languages, essentially meaning the wanderers, or the ones who move by water. But this wasn't some primitive boat paddling culture. We're talking about the Obertrites, Velati, Rugians, Pomeranians, and Wagrians, tribes that collectively controlled over 400 miles or 650 kilometers of Baltic coastline from modern-day eastern Germany through Poland. They commanded the Oder and Vistula river systems, controlled access to the amber trade routes, and had something Vikings could only dream of: permanent naval bases. While Norse vessels were optimized for raiding, fast, light, and designed to beach anywhere, Wendish ships were built for something entirely different. They were constructing what naval historians now recognize as some of the first true warships in northern European waters. Archaeological evidence from sites like Ralsvik on Rügen Island shows vessels up to 100 feet or 30 meters long, with reinforced hulls designed specifically for ramming enemy ships. Think Roman trireme meets Viking longship, with a healthy dose of Slavic engineering innovation. The Rugians, in particular, had turned the island of Rügen into what can only be described as a medieval naval fortress. Multiple harbours, shipyards capable of building vessels larger than anything the Vikings possessed, and, this is where it gets really impressive, a signal fire network that could communicate enemy movements across the entire Baltic in a matter of hours. The Vikings had mobility, the Wends had infrastructure, and they used it brilliantly. Consider the strategic choke points these tribes controlled. The Obertrites dominated the approaches to modern-day Lübeck Bay. The Pomeranians controlled the mouth of the Oder River. The Wagrians held the critical passages around what's now Kiel Bay. Any Viking force trying to access the lucrative trade routes connecting the Baltic to Central Europe had to run a gauntlet of Wendish-controlled waters. The numbers tell the story. While a typical Viking raiding fleet might consist of 3 to 5 longships carrying 150 to 250 warriors, Wendish naval forces regularly fielded coordinated fleets of 20 to 30 vessels. When the Danish king Canute attempted to assert control over Wendish territories in 1043, he faced a coordinated naval response of over 600 ships. 600. That's not a raiding party, that's a maritime army. But raw numbers only tell part of the story. The Wends had developed something that would become standard naval doctrine centuries later. The concept of layered maritime defense. Their coastal settlements weren't just trading posts, they were fortified naval bases with multiple defensive rings. Underwater obstacles to prevent enemy landings, signal towers for early warning, and most importantly, the ability to coordinate responses across hundreds of miles of coastline. But what truly unnerved Viking captains was this. The Wends didn't just defend their territory, they actively hunted in open waters. While Vikings targeted defenseless monasteries and trading posts, Wendish war fleets specifically sought out and engaged enemy naval forces. They had turned piracy into anti-piracy, and they were disturbingly good at it. The archaeological record from shipwrecks in the Baltic tells a sobering story. Dozens of Viking-era vessels show evidence of ramming damage, the distinctive crushed bow sections that indicate they were struck by purpose-built warships rather than damaged in storms or accidents. These aren't the remains of raids gone wrong. They're evidence of a systematic naval campaign designed to make the southern Baltic too dangerous for Viking operations. And it worked. By the 10th century, Viking expansion had largely shifted westward. It wasn't because the west was easier, it was because the southern Baltic had become too deadly. The Wends had achieved something extraordinary. They made the most feared raiders in Europe avoid their waters entirely. But when raiding failed, the Vikings tried something else. They came to conquer, and that's when things got even more intense. In 955 CE, a coalition of Danish and Norwegian raiders sailed 18 longships toward Rügen, expecting a typical tribute raid. Instead, they sailed into a coordinated ambush. The Rügian Wends, alerted by their signal fire network, assembled 35 purpose-built warships with reinforced bronze-fitted prows. The Wendish ships didn't grapple, they rammed. 14 Viking longships were sunk or captured in under 2 hours. Fewer than 200 of the 900 Vikings returned. The Danes later referred to it only as the Great Misfortune at the Island of Demons. This was no lucky win. The Wends had developed fleet tactics centuries ahead of their time. Designated ship roles, real-time coordination via horn and flag signals, and a strategic grasp of naval formations Vikings lacked. Viking fleets, built for speed and autonomy, struggled to respond. Instead of adapting, Viking leaders largely avoided Wendish waters. Raiding became economically unsustainable. Even a successful attack often meant devastating losses. So they shifted focus west, to Anglo-Saxon monasteries and Irish coasts. But the Wends weren't content with defense. By the late 10th century, they were launching their own raids. The 991 CE attack on Hedeby, a critical Viking trade hub, proved how far things had turned. A 22-ship Wendish fleet struck at dawn, burned harbour facilities, destroyed merchant vessels, and vanished before a response could form. Hedeby was considered impregnable until that day. The Wends had an edge: intelligence. Unlike the opportunistic Viking model, Wendish raids were planned with precision, informed by extensive trade networks that doubled as spy channels. One final campaign highlights their strategic brilliance. In 1018, Snut the Great launched a 200-ship assault. The Wends retreated inland, let the Danes overextend, then hit isolated garrisons through ambushes. By spring, Snut had gained no ground and lost a third of his force. When Vikings finally abandoned ships and took the fight to land, they thought they'd bypass the problem. They were wrong, because the Wends had spent just as much time mastering fortresses as they had the sea. A typical Viking land assault in the 10th century began with 300 to 500 warriors beaching their longships. They quickly formed a shield wall and advanced toward their target with precision. Most settlements, even fortified ones, would fall within hours. The combination of psychological terror, superior weapons, and coordinated tactics was simply overwhelming for most defensive forces. Now imagine those same battle-hardened Vikings approaching a Wendish settlement and stopping dead in their tracks, staring up at defensive works that seemed to defy everything they knew about medieval fortification. Because the Wends had spent centuries turning the science of castle building into an art form that would make modern military engineers nod in professional appreciation. Take the Obertreit stronghold at Oldenburg. When Danish forces encountered it in 983 CE, they faced concentric defensive rings nearly half a mile out from the center. These weren't just ditches and stakes. Excavations show hidden pits, weakened ground, and sharpened stakes, meant to break enemy ranks before they even saw a wall. And those walls, not the standard vertical palisades. The Wends used interlocked horizontal timbers, distributing shock across the structure. Battering rams were all but useless. Gateways and corners, the usual weak points, were replaced with offset entries and interlocking firing angles that turned them into kill zones. Add to that elevated central keeps on man-made mounds, giving Wendish defenders clear lines of fire over every barrier. The psychological toll was immense. Vikings were used to seeing what they were attacking. Wendish forts revealed nothing but the next wall. When Danish Prince Magnus assaulted the Rugian fortress at Bergen in 1043, his army spent 3 days fighting through outer defenses, only to discover they hadn't even reached the heart of the settlement. A third of his army deserted before dawn. But it wasn't just about defense. The Wends built for counterattack. Hidden sally ports allowed for night raids. Tunnels let defenders emerge behind enemy lines. Elevated platforms launched coordinated barrages. One striking example, at Wallin in 1066, Swedish besiegers believed they had the fortress surrounded, only for Wendish forces to erupt from underground, torch their siege works, and vanish again. The siege collapsed overnight. Many fortresses included sea access, allowing reinforcements and supplies even under siege. The fortress at Arkona, perched atop 150-foot chalk cliffs, could only be reached by sea, past defensive towers and underwater obstacles. By the early 11th century, Viking commanders had learned the hard way. Wendish fortresses weren't just hard to take, they were nearly impossible. And yet, even as Vikings retreated, other enemies were closing in. Enemies with more patience and far more resources. Here's what the sagas don't tell you about Viking victories against the Wends. They came at staggering cost. Take the 1018 capture of Ratzeburg. Celebrated in Norse chronicles, it required 8 months, 2,400 warriors, and 32 ships. The defenders, fewer than 800. Viking losses, nearly 60%. Afterward, Danish leadership quietly required royal approval for any operation in Wendish territory. It wasn't just caution, it was economic survival. A typical Viking raid on Anglo-Saxon land might yield massive returns with 10 to 15% casualties. Wendish campaigns often ended in 40 to 50% losses, and the settlements, well prepared, yielded little plunder. The psychological impact was just as bad. Vikings thrived on their identity as apex predators, but the Wends had flipped that script. Suddenly, the wolves weren't hunting, they were being hunted. By 1050, Viking expansion had pivoted west. Britain, Ireland, even North America. Not because they ran out of ambition, because the Baltic had become a death trap. Wendish resistance had a ripple effect. Their naval chokehold pushed Norse forces into new territories. Their intelligence networks quietly manipulated power dynamics across Scandinavia. They gathered intel through trade channels and used it to plan devastatingly precise counter-raids. In 1034, King Magnus of Denmark assembled 47 ships in total secrecy to assault Arkona. The Wends were waiting, ambush preset, tactics known, positions anticipated. Only 12 ships returned. Magnus didn't. The source of the intelligence leak? Never identified. But it showed the Wends weren't just resisting, they were infiltrating. By the mid-11th century, Wendish networks had grown so effective that Viking raids became blind stabs against a foe who always seemed a step ahead. Surprise, the Vikings' greatest weapon was gone. And worse, other Baltic communities were learning. Wendish-style fortifications, coordinated defenses, and trade-based intelligence began spreading. The Viking Age wasn't just fading, it was being dismantled, piece by piece. But if the Wends thought their dominance would go unchallenged, they were about to face something no ambush or fortress could stop. A holy war with no exit plan. If there's one thing more dangerous than being weak in medieval Europe, it's being too successful while remaining pagan. The Wends were about to learn that the hard way. By 1140 CE, Wendish control of Baltic trade and their unmatched military innovations had become a strategic concern for Christian kingdoms. The response? The Wendish Crusade of 1147, a campaign not of conquest, but cultural annihilation, backed by the Pope and a coalition of German, Danish, and Polish forces. This wasn't a raid. Over 100,000 crusaders, 500 ships, and siege weapons descended on Wendish territory. Leaders like Henry the Lion and King Svein III of Denmark came not to pillage, but to erase. Wendish resistance followed a familiar pattern: inland retreats, naval raids on supply lines, and fortified strongholds ready for siege. But this time, it wasn't enough. Crusaders had studied the Viking failures. They brought engineers to collapse tunnels, built overwhelming siege lines, and cut off intelligence networks that had once made the Wends unbeatable. The fall of Dobin after 6 months was a turning point, not through assault, but starvation. Surrender meant conversion, integration, and the systematic dismantling of Wendish autonomy. This wasn't just military defeat, it was full-spectrum cultural replacement. Captured towns were rebuilt with Christian institutions, German laws, and imported settlers. Tribal identities were erased, and pagan temples replaced with churches. Even coordinated tribal defense couldn't stop it. The final blow came in 1164 at the Battle of Verchen. Prince Niklot's coalition of 15,000 warriors was crushed in under 4 hours. Niklot fell in a last charge, and with him, Wendish independence. But their legacy didn't vanish. The Crusaders adopted Wendish fortification methods. German castles borrowed their timber layering and elevation defense. Danish fleets applied Wendish naval tactics. Their final fortress, Arkona, fell in 1168. Not from failure of design, but from unrelenting resources applied over 2 years. The Wends were gone, but the kingdoms that destroyed them built their own power using Wendish innovations. They had defied the Vikings, rewired Baltic warfare, and reshaped the map of medieval Europe. And yet, within a generation, all that remained of them was legend, borrowed tactics, and fading stone markers on the edge of the sea. However, they weren't the only tribe the Vikings learned to fear, or failed to break. Across the Baltic, another name stirred dread in Norse hearts: fierce raiders who turned Viking tactics against them and vanished into myth when the wars ended. We've all heard the tales: horned helmets, brutal raids, and the thunderous war cries of Norse warriors striking terror into the hearts of European coastal villages. But history holds a fascinating twist that rarely makes it into popular documentaries. There existed a mysterious people who turned the tables on these legendary raiders. While monks trembled at the sight of dragon-prowed ships on the horizon, Viking warriors themselves whispered warnings about venturing too far into certain northern territories. These lands belonged to a people so fierce, so enigmatic, that even the battle-hardened Norse approached with uncharacteristic caution, if they dared approach at all. In the mist-shrouded borderlands where northern Finland meets Russia's Kola Peninsula, existed a people known to the Norse as the Biarmians. Unlike other groups that fell quickly under Viking dominance, the Biarmians maintained their autonomy throughout the Viking Age, controlling the valuable trade routes along the White Sea and the resource-rich territories surrounding it. Archaeological excavations in the region have uncovered settlements with sophisticated fortifications dating from 800 to 1100 CE, precisely the period when Viking expansion was at its peak elsewhere. What made the Biarmians particularly formidable was their mastery of the harsh taiga environment, a landscape of dense forests, freezing temperatures reaching -40 degrees Celsius, and long periods of either constant darkness or midnight sun. While Vikings were unquestionably skilled seafarers, the Biarmians moved through these frozen forests with a speed and silence that contemporary accounts described as ghost-like, or as if melting into the trees themselves. The Byzantine historian Michael Attaliates, writing in the 11th century, noted that even the Rus Vikings from what is now Sweden and Ukraine speak with unusual restraint about the forest people of the far north, claiming they can strike without warning and disappear without trace. Archaeological evidence supports this reputation. Biarmian hunting weapons show sophisticated design elements that suggest specialized stealth tactics, including arrows designed for minimal sound and maximum penetration through the heavy furs worn by Norse warriors. Perhaps most telling is what's found in Viking burial sites within 100 kilometers of Biarmian territory. Defensive weapons and protective amulets appear with much greater frequency than in Viking graves elsewhere, suggesting warriors expecting particularly dangerous opposition. One remarkable find from a chieftain's burial near modern-day Arkhangelsk included a runic warning etched into a sword hilt: "Beware the watchers in the White Forest," a rare acknowledgement of fear from a culture that typically celebrated death in battle as the ultimate honor. The Norse sagas, while often blending history with mythology, provide our most detailed window into Viking encounters with the Biarmians. The Egil's saga, composed in the 13th century, but recounting events from the 10th century, describes a raid led by the legendary warrior Thorolf Kveldulfsson into Biarmian territory. What begins as a typical Viking expedition quickly transforms into a cautionary tale. They came upon the Biarmians in the night, when these people melted like shadows between the trees. Thorolf's men found themselves surrounded, though they saw no army. Arrows came from all directions, striking with uncanny accuracy even in the darkness. Of 30 men who ventured inland, only 7 returned to their ships. The saga of Urva Odder contains an even more striking account, describing how a band of Vikings had to abandon their traditional battle formation when ambushed by Biarmians. They attacked like no men we had faced before, appearing suddenly from the snow itself, striking and vanishing again. Our shield wall became useless when they would not stand before us. The Ynglinga saga offers perhaps the most telling insight into the psychological impact these encounters had on Viking warriors. It records a Norse chieftain's advice to his son: "Seek glory in the western lands, Britain Island, for the eastern forests belong to those who know secrets we do not. Men who go there seeking plunder often return without honor, if they return at all." However, because they depart from typical saga narratives, Viking literature rarely acknowledged fear or defeat at the hands of other tribes, instead portraying Norse warriors as the supreme fighters of their age. These admissions of vulnerability and caution stand out as unusual historical truths that survived even the saga writer's tendency toward glorification. The Vikings' apprehension wasn't merely superstition. Archaeological and historical evidence reveals the Biarmians employed combat strategies that specifically countered Norse advantages. While Vikings excelled at shield wall formations and direct confrontation, the Biarmians developed asymmetric warfare techniques that rendered these tactics ineffective. Excavations of Biarmian hunting grounds have uncovered specialized weapons designed for stealth and ambush. Their arrows featured innovative fletching that significantly reduced flight noise, allowing archers to remain undetected even after multiple shots. Analysis of these arrowheads shows they were specifically designed to penetrate the layered leather and limited chainmail that Viking raiders typically wore. The Bjarmians also mastered winter warfare in ways that gave them overwhelming territorial advantage. Artifacts discovered at settlement sites include early versions of skis that were narrower and more maneuverable than those used by Vikings, allowing rapid deployment through deep snow. Some burial sites contain specialized footwear with retractable bone spikes, essentially primitive crampons, enabling movement across icy terrain that would leave Viking warriors struggling to maintain footing. Beyond their skill in navigating harsh terrain, the Bjarmians also employed hunting techniques adapted for human targets. Historical accounts describe elaborate traps set along forest paths, forcing Vikings to choose between trudging through deep snow or following trails that might conceal deadfalls or snares. The 12th century Danish historian Saxo Grammaticus described a particularly effective Bjarmian tactic. They would allow a small Viking party to penetrate their territory unchallenged, then cut off their retreat by felling trees across their path, before attacking from all sides. Their night raids on Viking camps were perhaps the most terrifying. Multiple Norse sources describe warriors who could approach sleeping encampments without alerting sentries, sometimes killing several men before anyone realized they were under attack. This ability to strike without warning created a psychological terror that deeply affected Vikings, whose own reputation relied heavily on being the unpredictable aggressors rather than the vulnerable targets. Beyond their military prowess, certain Bjarmian cultural practices fundamentally unsettled Viking sensibilities, creating a psychological barrier that often proved more effective than physical defenses. Archaeological evidence from Bjarmian burial sites reveals funerary customs that would have appeared deeply taboo to Norse observers. Unlike Viking burials, which typically included weapons and personal possessions, Bjarmian graves often contained ritualistic items arranged in geometric patterns that archaeologists believe held astronomical significance. Viking observers were particularly struck by the Bjarmians' mortuary practices. While Vikings typically honored their dead through ship burials or cremation, accounts suggest that the Bjarmians preserved their chieftains' remains through a method resembling mummification. Ibn Fadlan, a 10th century Arab diplomat, recorded descriptions of northern tribes keeping the remains of their ancestors intact. This approach to honoring the dead contrasted with Viking customs, which emphasized specific funerary rites. The Bjarmian social structure also challenged Norse understanding. Evidence suggests they maintained a non-patriarchal society where women held significant military and leadership roles. The Varangian chronicler Nikephoros noted, "Among these people, both men and women defend their territory with equal ferocity, and a woman's arrow finds its mark as surely as a man's." For Viking raiders, accustomed to facing male warriors and viewing women primarily as non-combatants, encountering female fighters would have disrupted their tactical expectations and cultural assumptions. The Bjarmians maintained strict territorial boundaries, marked by distinctive carved posts that served as warnings to outsiders. Archaeological finds reveal these markers featured depictions of predatory animals and abstract symbols in a style distinct from Norse artistic traditions. Viking accounts describe these boundary markers in uneasy terms, suggesting they considered crossing these thresholds as tempting both physical danger and supernatural consequences. The Bjarmians' most formidable advantage lay in their profound adaptation to one of Earth's most unforgiving environments. While Vikings were certainly hardy seafarers, accustomed to harsh North Atlantic conditions, the deep taiga and tundra landscapes of the White Sea region presented challenges beyond their experience. Modern climate data shows this region experiences temperature extremes ranging from -45 degrees Celsius in winter to 30 degrees Celsius in summer, fluctuations that require specialized knowledge to navigate safely. Archaeological evidence reveals the Bjarmians developed technological innovations specifically tailored to these conditions. excavations at settlement sites have uncovered sophisticated semi-subterranean dwellings that maintained remarkably stable internal temperatures. Analysis of these structures shows they combined principles of insulation and thermal mass that exceed the efficiency of contemporary Viking longhouses by a significant margin. One particularly well-preserved dwelling discovered near modern-day Severodvinsk maintained an estimated internal temperature of 15 degrees Celsius, even when external temperatures dropped below -30 degrees Celsius, all without continuous firing of hearths. The Biamians' winter mobility technologies gave them a decisive tactical advantage. While Vikings essentially ceased major land operations during deep winter, the Biamians maintained activity year-round. Specialized ski designs found in Biamian territories feature a distinctive asymmetrical pattern, one ski shorter and wider for pushing, one longer and narrower for gliding. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated these designs allow speeds up to 15 kilometers per hour across snow, faster than a Viking in full gear could run on cleared ground. Contemporary accounts describe how Biamians use natural features as defensive infrastructure. The Arab geographer al-Idrisi, compiling information from northern traders, noted, "These forest people know when the ice will bear weight and when it will break. They lead pursuers onto lakes where the ice appears solid but will shatter beneath armed men." Modern glaciologists confirm that the region's freeze-thaw cycles create precisely these conditions, where ice thickness can vary dramatically within short distances. Equally remarkable was their ability to navigate their territory with precision. Analysis of settlement patterns shows strategic positioning that balanced resource access with defense. Viking accounts frequently mention becoming disoriented in Biamian forests, while the locals moved effortlessly without visible markers. The Norse chronicler Oddr Snorrason wrote with reluctant admiration, "They move through their forests as easily in darkness as in daylight, while our bravest warriors become lost within sight of shore." While many encounters between Vikings and Biamians remain shrouded in legend, several historically verified confrontations demonstrate the practical reality behind Viking apprehension. Archaeological evidence corroborates these accounts, providing tangible proof of Norse defeats that rarely appear in their own historical narrative. The most thoroughly documented conflict occurred during Thorehund's expedition of 1026 CE. Contemporary accounts in both Norse sagas and Russian chronicles describe how this prominent Norwegian chieftain led a substantial force, estimated at 300 warriors in 3 longships, into Biamian territory seeking trade advantages and tribute. The expedition began successfully with initial trading, but when Thorir's forces attempted to raid a Biamian sacred site, the response was swift and devastating. Archaeological excavations near the White Sea coast have uncovered what appears to be the aftermath of this very conflict. A mass grave containing approximately 40 individuals, buried with Norse weapons and personal items dating to the early 11th century. Skeletal analysis reveals injuries consistent with ambush tactics. A high proportion of wounds to the rear of the skull and back, suggesting attacks from behind. Carbon dating confirms these remains to the precise period of Thorir's expedition. The Varangian Chronicle provides additional context, noting, "Of Thorir's 3 ships that sailed east, only one returned to Norway, so reduced in men that boys had to help work the oars. This represents a casualty rate approaching 70%, catastrophic for a Viking expedition, and the type of defeat that would generate lasting caution." Another significant encounter, known as the Battle of Sleeping Fires from Norse accounts, demonstrates the Biamians' defensive sophistication. In approximately 995 CE, an expeditionary force led by Erik Hakonarson attempted a winter raid, reasoning that frozen waterways would provide easy access to Biamian settlements. Excavations near the Devina River have revealed a carefully prepared defensive position. Concealed fire pits containing oil-soaked materials that could be ignited on command, creating sudden walls of flame to channel attacking forces into prepared ambush positions. The Norse account describes the outcome bluntly. The forest people let them penetrate deep into the frozen river, then surrounded them with fires that sprang from the ice itself. Caught between flames and hidden archers, Eric's force was reduced to half before they fought free. Archaeological finds reveal Viking adaptations in response to these conflicts. Excavations of 11th century Norse settlements show a distinct modification to shields and armor among warriors known to have engaged with Biamians. Increased protection to the rear and flanks, additional leather reinforcement against arrow strikes, and the introduction of specialized face protection beyond what was typically used in other Viking conflicts. These adaptations speak to hard-earned knowledge of Biamian tactics and represent a significant investment in defensive rather than offensive capability, unusual for Viking military development. Despite frequent conflict, necessity drove Vikings and Biamians into complex trade relationships. While battles shaped their interactions, so did commerce, creating a structured exchange network that ensured goods flowed in both directions. One of the most striking pieces of evidence is the Kolmogeri hoard, discovered in 1989. This cache of 1,700 silver coins and trade goods reveals a blend of Byzantine, Arabic, and Norse silver, some marked with Biamian ownership. Its dating suggests that trade persisted even at the height of hostilities, proving economic ties could override warfare. Viking sites along the North Sea contain clear traces of Biamian influence, including high-quality furs, Baltic amber, and walrus ivory crafted with distinctive techniques. Even their food supply benefited. Analysis of Viking cooking vessels shows evidence of Biamian fish preservation methods that greatly extended storage life. In return, Biamians received Norse iron tools, textiles, and exotic goods from distant markets like Baghdad and Constantinople. The organized distribution of these items suggests structured trade rather than sporadic plunder. Historical sources further confirm these exchanges. The Gortrek saga describes designated neutral trading zones where neither side held an advantage, while Othere of Hålogaland's account mentions a silent bartering system where goods were exchanged without direct negotiation. Archaeological findings support this, with excavations near Kandalaksha revealing hybrid trade structures designed for winter exchanges. Separate entrances and strategically placed fire pits allowed both sides to conduct business while maintaining a cautious distance. Biamian resistance shaped Viking expansion, creating a stable eastern boundary throughout the Viking Age. While Vikings spread west, south, and along Russian rivers, their presence in Biamian lands remained limited to trade outposts. This was not due to geography alone, but to the effectiveness of Biamian defenses, which created a lasting barrier to Norse settlement. Over time, a distinct frontier zone emerged, blending Norse and Biamian influences but preventing full Norse control. This borderland saw cultural exchange, yet it remained a line Vikings rarely crossed in force. As a result, Norse traders were forced to seek alternative routes, leading to their deepening presence in Russian river networks and contributing to the rise of Kievan Rus. Unlike many groups absorbed into Norse spheres, the Biamians retained their identity well into the 12th century. Historical records and genetic studies confirm minimal Norse influence beyond this frontier, reinforcing how their resistance shaped the long-term geopolitical landscape of Northern Europe. Vikings, terrifying Norse warriors, have dominated our imagination for over a millennium. Dragon-proud longships cutting through fog-shrouded waters, battle-hardened raiders descending on unsuspecting monasteries, their very name becoming synonymous with maritime terror. But here's where our neat historical narrative hits a snag, one that most people never hear about. Even the Vikings had waters they dared not enter. In the eastern Baltic, something darker lurked. Meet the Curonians, the sea raiders that history somehow forgot to mention in the same breath as Vikings, despite striking fear into Norse hearts for centuries. These weren't some minor coastal tribes scraping by on fishing and petty theft. The Curonians controlled the Courland Peninsula, a strategic stretch of Baltic coastline covering what we now call Western Latvia and parts of Lithuania. From their base along this windswept shore, they commanded one of the most lucrative and dangerous positions in medieval Europe, the intersection of major trade routes between Scandinavia, Russia, and the Germanic territories. But calling them simple pirates would be like calling a wolf just another dog. The Curonians had evolved into something far more sophisticated and infinitely more dangerous. They operated a maritime empire built on three pillars: raiding, trading, and slave-taking. And they'd perfected all three to a degree that made even Viking chieftains take notice. What made the Curonians particularly unsettling was their dual nature. One day, they might engage in perfectly legitimate trade negotiations with Swedish merchants, exchanging amber and furs for silver and iron. The next day, those same merchants might find themselves fleeing Curonian war parties, bent on capturing them for the slave markets of Kiev or Constantinople. This unpredictability created a psychological weapon almost as powerful as their actual ships and spears. The Curonians understood something that many other Baltic peoples missed. The sea wasn't just a highway for trade, it was a hunting ground. While other groups focused on defending their territories or establishing permanent settlements, the Curonians perfected the art of maritime predation. They turned the Baltic's complex geography of islands, shoals, and hidden channels into their personal maze, where they could appear and disappear at will. Unlike the agricultural communities that dotted most of the Baltic coast, Curonian settlements were essentially naval bases. Every able-bodied man was expected to serve on the ships. Their children grew up learning to read currents and winds before they could properly read runes. Their women often managed the complex logistics of outfitting expeditions and processing the wealth that flowed back from successful raids. And warfare was not merely a means of acquiring glory or settling disputes. It was a business. Curonian raids were carefully planned operations with specific objectives, detailed intelligence gathering, and sophisticated risk assessment. They studied their targets, learned their weaknesses, and struck with surgical precision. This wasn't the berserker fury of Viking warfare. This was calculated, methodical, and devastatingly effective. The Vikings, despite all their maritime prowess, had never encountered anything quite like this. Norse raiders were accustomed to inspiring fear, not feeling it. They were used to being the wolves, not the sheep. But in the labyrinthine waters of the eastern Baltic, the Curonians had created conditions where even the most experienced Viking crews found themselves outmaneuvered, outgunned, and very much out of their depth. The secret to Curonian dominance lay in a single, devastating advantage. They had engineered their entire naval strategy around the Baltic's most treacherous characteristic, its deceptively shallow waters. While Viking longships were marvels of engineering designed for deep-water ocean crossings and river navigation, they had a fatal flaw in Baltic coastal warfare. These vessels, typically drawing 2 to 3 feet of water when fully loaded, were simply too deep for the intricate shallow water combat that defined Eastern Baltic conflicts. The Curonians, however, had spent generations perfecting vessels that could operate in water barely knee-deep. Their ships, which archaeologists believe were precursors to the later cog design, featured revolutionary shallow draft hulls that could navigate in as little as 18 inches of water. This wasn't just a minor technical advantage, it was a complete game changer. Imagine being a Viking raider, confident in your superior seamanship, only to watch enemy vessels seemingly glide across waters where your own ships would run aground within minutes. But the Curonians didn't stop at ship design. They had transformed the Baltic's geography itself into a weapon system. The eastern Baltic coast is a maze of over 2,000 islands, countless hidden reefs, and shifting sandbars that can trap unwary vessels for days. What looked like navigational nightmares to outsiders were highways to the Curonians. They had mapped every channel, memorized every tide pattern, and could navigate these waters in conditions that would terrify even experienced Norse pilots. Consider the tactical implications. A Viking raiding fleet approaching Curonian territory would find themselves forced into predictable deep water channels, essentially announcing their arrival hours in advance. Meanwhile, Curonian scout vessels could shadow them from parallel shallow channels, completely invisible to their targets. When the moment came to strike, Curonian ships could attack from directions that seemed impossible, emerging from waters the Vikings considered unnavigable. Their intimate knowledge of local weather patterns provided another crucial edge. The Baltic's notorious sudden storms, which could transform calm seas into ship-killing tempests within hours, were less random to those who understood the signs. Curonian navigators could read wind shifts, cloud formations, and wave patterns with supernatural precision. They would deliberately time their attacks for moments when approaching weather would trap enemy fleets in exposed positions. Even more unsettling was their mastery of seasonal warfare. The Baltic's extreme seasonal variations, from summer's endless daylight to winter's months of darkness, created opportunities that the Curonians exploited ruthlessly. Winter raids were particularly terrifying, as Curonian warriors could use the cover of polar night to approach completely undetected, striking sleeping settlements with devastating effectiveness. Their weapons technology reflected this specialized approach to coastal warfare. While Vikings favored axes and swords designed for close combat on ship decks, Curonians developed spears and javelins optimized for fighting in shallow water and marshy terrain. They perfected the use of crossbows, relatively rare in Scandinavia, but devastatingly effective for picking off enemies from concealed positions among the reeds and islands. The morning of August 15th, 1187, should have been just another successful Viking raid. A Danish fleet under King Canute VI had swept into the Baltic, targeting what they assumed would be easy pickings along the Curonian coast. These weren't inexperienced raiders. Many had participated in successful expeditions to England and Ireland. They knew their business. By evening, the survivors would be rowing desperately back toward Danish waters, their fleet decimated and their king barely escaping with his life. The attack began like so many others. The Danish ships had positioned themselves offshore at dawn, preparing to launch their assault on a Curonian settlement. But as they moved into attack formation, something went wrong. Ships that had been sailing in deep water suddenly found themselves scraping bottom on hidden sandbars. The Curonians had somehow manipulated the very seabed, using their knowledge of shifting sands to create underwater traps. What followed wasn't a battle, it was a systematic destruction. Curonian vessels materialized from channels the Danes hadn't even noticed, attacking the immobilized ships from impossible angles. Danish warriors, trained for conventional ship-to-ship combat, found themselves fighting an enemy that refused to engage on familiar terms. Instead of the expected boarding actions and axe battles, they faced a rain of crossbow bolts from concealed positions and coordinated ramming attacks from vessels that seemed to dance across the water. But the Curonians weren't interested in simply sinking Danish ships. They were capturing them. More specifically, they were capturing the crews alive. For Vikings, who expected to die gloriously in battle, the prospect of being taken alive was far worse than death. It meant slavery, ransom, or ritual sacrifice, fates that stripped them of dignity and denied them any form of warrior's end. The psychological impact of this defeat rippled throughout Scandinavia. Suddenly, Baltic expeditions were no longer guaranteed profit ventures. Swedish and Danish kings found themselves having to offer significantly higher rewards to recruit crews willing to risk Curonian waters. Some experienced raiders simply refused to sail east of Gotland, considering it too dangerous regardless of potential rewards. The Curonians had achieved something remarkable. They had made the Vikings afraid of the sea. This wasn't an isolated incident. Historical records, though frustratingly sparse, contain references to multiple Viking defeats in Curonian waters. The 1198 expedition that resulted in the capture of several prominent Norwegian jarls. The devastating ambush of 1203 that wiped out an entire Swedish raiding fleet near modern-day Liepāja. The mysterious disappearance of Olaf Tryggvason's advance scouts in 999, which some historians believe was orchestrated by Curonian intelligence networks. Each defeat followed a similar pattern. Confident Viking forces entering what they assumed were familiar waters, only to find themselves outmaneuvered by an enemy that seemed to control the very elements. The Curonians had turned the Baltic into their personal arena, where superior seamanship, local knowledge, and tactical innovation could overcome traditional Viking advantages in weapons and warrior culture. Perhaps most unsettling of all was how the Curonians treated their victories. Unlike Vikings, who celebrated their conquests in elaborate sagas and boastful poems, the Curonians remained mysteriously quiet about their successes. This silence was itself a weapon. Vikings never knew when or where the next attack might come, creating a persistent anxiety that followed Norse expeditions throughout the eastern Baltic. What truly set the Curonians apart wasn't just their ability to defeat Vikings in battle, it was what they did with their captives afterward. While most medieval warriors viewed prisoners as either ransom opportunities or additional mouths to feed, the Curonians had developed an industrial-scale slave trading operation that stretched from the Baltic to the Byzantine Empire. The numbers alone tell a chilling story. Historical records suggest that during the height of their power, Curonian slave markets processed thousands of captives annually. But these weren't random raids for human cargo. This was a precisely orchestrated business model that targeted specific types of prisoners based on market demand hundreds of miles away. Vikings, with their reputation as fierce warriors and skilled craftsmen, commanded premium prices in the slave markets of Kiev, Constantinople, and Cairo. A captured Viking jarl could be worth more than an entire season's worth of traditional raids. This economic reality transformed every Viking expedition into a potential treasure hunt for Curonian raiders. They weren't just fighting to defend their territory, they were actively hunting some of the most valuable human commodities in medieval Europe. The Curonians had perfected a capture and processing system that would have impressed Roman slavers. Temporary holding facilities dotted the Courland coast, designed to keep large numbers of prisoners alive and healthy during the sorting process. The most valuable captives, nobles, skilled craftsmen, and young warriors were separated for long-distance transport to premium markets. Others were sold locally or put to work in Curonian settlements. But here's what made this particularly psychological warfare. The Curonians deliberately publicized the fates of their high-profile captives. Word would filter back to Scandinavia about prominent Vikings spotted in slave markets from Novgorod to Baghdad. A Danish noble captured in 1195 was reportedly seen years later serving as a galley slave on Byzantine ships. Swedish warriors taken in coastal raids appeared in the retinues of wealthy Arab merchants. This wasn't just about the economic value of slaves, it was psychological warfare. The prospect of ending up in chains thousands of miles from home, serving foreign masters who didn't even speak their language, was a fate that shattered Viking pride. The Curonians even developed specialized capture techniques designed to take prisoners alive rather than kill them outright. They used nets, weighted ropes, and coordinated grappling tactics that focused on disabling rather than destroying enemy crews. Their ships carried extra provisions specifically for transporting captives, and their raiders trained extensively in non-lethal combat methods. Archaeological evidence suggests they maintained detailed records of their captives, essentially inventory management for human cargo. Bone artifacts found in Curonian settlements include what appear to be tally markers, possibly used to track prisoners by origin, condition, and market value. This level of organization indicates a slave trade operation that rivaled anything seen in medieval Europe. The psychological impact extended beyond individual captives. Viking communities lived in constant fear that their men might not just die in battle, but disappear entirely into the vast slave networks that stretched across Eurasia. Families had no way of knowing whether missing warriors were dead or suffering in bondage thousands of miles away. This uncertainty created a unique form of trauma that traditional Viking culture was unprepared to handle. Here's one of history's most revealing silences: the Viking sagas, those epic tales glorifying Norse victories and heroic deaths, barely mention the Curonians. For a culture obsessed with martial glory, that absence speaks volumes. Viking sagas weren't objective records. They were cultural propaganda reinforcing Norse identity. Glorious deaths, always included, but defeats at the hands of Baltic tribes, quietly erased. Other enemies like Anglo-Saxons or Franks appear even in defeat, so long as it looked heroic. But the Curonians offered no such narrative. Vikings captured, outmaneuvered, or enslaved didn't fit the mold. The few mentions, troubles in eastern waters, are vague, as if the truth was too painful to record. Practical reasons played a role too. Viking raids were funded ventures. Admitting crushing losses in Curonian waters risked future investments. Silence became strategy. It went deeper than pride. Viking society was built on the myth of martial superiority. Their economy, religion, and social order all depended on it. Acknowledging repeated defeats would unravel the foundation. But cracks emerged during the Northern Crusades of the 12th and 13th centuries. Christian chroniclers now had reason to detail Curonian resistance, framing them as pagans to be conquered. These accounts, ironically, revealed just how advanced Curonian warfare had become. Crusading armies with superior tech still struggled for decades to break their defenses. Even then, Viking-era losses remained buried. It was easier to reframe the conflict as a righteous crusade than admit Scandinavia's greatest warriors had once feared these Baltic raiders.